Welcome to Sean's Thoughts. How are you doing today? I hope that you're enjoying your amazing day as much as I am with this beautiful blue sky and, bright, brilliant light that shines upon us today, as it perhaps always have, but yet we've been maybe on the other side of an illusion that perhaps stifled our dreams to a point where we were unable to perhaps know what was in store or what the menu was through our own experiences and such. So before I get into all of that and before I step into the frame and talk about my podcast today, which I've currently titled Dreaming Far Too Small, or in the sense, Dreaming Too Small. And two means that we essentially are dreaming, but yet perhaps our dreams aren't all that, we could perhaps imagine if we were given the menu and the potential of what could be. So thank you for joining me. And as I said before I step into the frame, I wanted to apologize because for the last couple days, I've been intending to do a podcast, which I was going to talk about, everything that's Pokemon related with reflections upon the TV series Pokemon and the adventures of Ash and Pikachu and all of his beloved friends. And yet I was challenged just because when creating the thumbnail, I kept getting told that I wasn't even allowed to use the word Ash or Pikachu within the thumbnail by the program that I was working with because somehow me using those words was a copyright infringement and such. And so regardless, I've had a lot of other different events that have been taking place within my life, which actually they've all essentially led me to where I am now and this talk that I wanted to have with you today. So I'm just checking to see because I honestly feel that this would be a terrific frame for my moving portraits or perhaps something that I want to do in the future. And so, as I've always said, I like to leave at least 3 minutes of video in the beginning so that if I do choose to somehow utilize it, it'll be empty. And what we're looking at right now is just a dockside on a pier, rundown, bench sitting in front of, the Fraser River. And, off in the distance, if you can see over there, there's a whole bunch of people who have perhaps chosen to live differently than the traditional people living right on the edge of the Fraser River. And although this river definitely requires a lot of maintenance and cleaning and removing of the mud and such of all the industry over the, since the forestry days where the Fraser River was used as a major conduit for deforesting the Golden Ears provincial parklands and then sending all of that forestry, all of those logs and timber down this particular river. Actually, I'm sitting in front of a whole bunch that have essentially caught up to this area and got stuck. But nonetheless, those are all what's in the past. And what we're looking forward today is moving towards the future. So welcome to Sean's Thoughts. My name is Sean, and that's with a W. And yeah, I I have the sunlight in my eyes, so I'm gonna kind of look over here. The sunlight's like right in that direction right now. So today, what I wanted to talk about was my own personal experiences with dreaming too small. And, essentially for some, dreaming too small might be something, but actually, I'm going to take off my shoes because I would prefer not to be wearing shoes. So, back to what I was saying. So, dreaming too small perhaps is something that, many people have done. Oh, here comes a train. But this time, we're going to appreciate the train. I remember last time when I was creating a podcast and the train came, I turned it off. And then the last actual time that it happened, I just appreciated, the train as it drove by and added that into the video that I was recording. We'll often find, and actually before I even get into my talk now, I'm going to let this train go by as, I see it for what it is. So please enjoy me while, I sit for a moment and do nothing unwilling to allow distraction and distortion to enter into my field, and really appreciating this train for just being a train. Welcome back. I was so blessed that that was a short train. And the whole time that I was sitting here, I was having these ideas, or perhaps, whispers of your camera's going to fall, your camera's going to fall, cancel, cancel, because I trust that everything works out perfectly fine. And regardless of, those distortive energies that try to perhaps, sway my focus and my intention and overall my, enjoyment of this blessed day that I'm essentially graced with. Welcome back. So, yeah, we're going to talk today about my experiences with dreaming too small. And, you know, in the past, I've always had many different dreams, and I've shared them in, my blueprint playlist that you can find. I'll probably post it here because I like to post the content that I talk about, so that should you choose to, you know, learn more about what I'm wanting to do, what I envision doing, what I already know I will be a part of doing, you can, check that out there. And so this blueprint playlist is essentially a I forgot the word is, but it's a playlist of a couple different projects that I would love to be a part of, and it's essentially a place that, you know, for those who do wish to dream big, that's something that perhaps you will find of interest. And so my own experiences I've talked about is this idea of dreaming too small. And actually, I had a video pop into my feed, interestingly enough, talking about dreaming too small. And it could perhaps have been, my higher self or my monad or God or, the algorithm on YouTube, whatever it is. It could have been something that I said in one of my podcasts. Because sometimes when I talk about different topics in my podcast, I often see videos pop up which relate to that. And you'll essentially find that out yourself, that when you are watching certain videos, other videos that the algorithm, that perhaps your own team of healing experts, guide into your field. And that's why I mentioned before in one of my former podcasts or recent thereof, that limiting or perhaps not allowing videos that you don't recognize or don't resonate with, by clicking on to that video recommendation and going down and scrolling down to the do not subscribe this channel part, and allowing that to open up space. And so, with all that being said, I take what I come that as perhaps, little little breadcrumbs along my way. And so I want to share this dream that I've had for quite a long time. See, in 2009, I purchased a car, a wonderful, beautiful Hyundai Elantra, and I've driven this car everywhere. It just turned 160,000 kilometers young, and I've driven this car all across Canada, as I've mentioned before, and I've driven this car all over British Columbia to Vancouver Island and so many different places. I've never been, a driver overall. So 160,000 kilometers, that may or may not seem like that much for a car that I guess is what, 17 years old. And I've taken care of this car. I made sure that when I purchased it, I did all of the glazing on the car and underneath, and I did what I could in order to keep it, as well as constantly taking it to the car wash, ensuring that it was looked after, maintenanced as best as possible with I could at the time that I could. And anyways, I've looked after this car, for which I'm truly grateful for. It's taken me to and from the plays that I produced and directed myself, daily trips to Vancouver, driving down the highway. Like, I've really enjoyed this car. It's actually the last car that my mother sat in before she passed away. It's maybe even, yeah, there's just so much history within that car. And anyways, so with all that being said, of course, we are all looking for something new. We live in a world where, new experiences and new things and sometimes are desired. And sometimes I feel, and I've come to recognize recently that sometimes the things that we want get mixed up with the experiences that we want. And where this story goes is that for the last several years, especially, and more importantly, the last year, I've been truly wanting to get a new vehicle. And actually, as part of the dream building process that I learned, going to a car lot, for example, and getting in the car, regardless if you had the ability to buy the car, going to the car show or the boat show, as I was explained by Kevin, going to, check out these things and imagining yourself as living there or being there or driving there. And so I actually participated in going with my son, and we went down to the Nissan dealership last year. And I really fell in love with this vehicle called the Nissan Rogue. And it truly represented at that time the ideal of what I would like to have in the ownership of a new car. And I sat in it, I talked to the salesperson, and, I looked at the Murano, I looked at other vehicles, I walked the car lot, you know, although I recognized at the time that I definitely didn't have that money sitting in my pocket, began that process of manifestation as I see it, of, feeling myself behind the wheel of the car. And at that time, it was a 2025 model. Moving on from that point in time, that car became fixed in my mind of the vehicle that I would choose to buy should I be given the opportunity to buy. And yet 2026 rolls around and those models are now gone, and now they're on to a new model, and soon they'll probably be on to a new model. Who knows? Who cares? And essentially, for the last many months or since the model came out, I now have been looking at, I want to own or I want to buy, more importantly, I'm using those words specifically. I want to buy a 2026 Nissan Rogue. And I'm looking at the platinum edition and, the all the bells and whistles and everything. And, I've moved over from being concerned about the electronics within a car because I recognize what's going on in our world and how perhaps the traumas and, limitations of our past, they've melted away to a degree that perhaps I'm not no lo- I'm that perhaps I, well, I am no longer concerned about many things that perhaps limited me before. And yet, through this whole experience, I've been challenged to wonder why, after everything that I'm doing, why wasn't this Nissan Rogue manifesting it in my life? And now, if you're perhaps in resonant frequency with me, you'll understand many of a lot of the ideas that I'm essentially sharing with you here. And of course, if you are here for other reasons, nefarious or thereof, well, then perhaps you'll like have, criticism for that type of possibility or potential. But yet, I push forward having that as an item that you can say is on my dream board. Now, this dream board being a metaphorical dream board, as I've basically, I popped it in my head. I put it on the inner parts of my head, and I think about it, and I imagine it, and I even watched all the little videos that Nissan made about it, and I imagine, the adventures that my son and I and the other people that are eventually to be realized within my reality driving around. And yet, as I said, it was challenging for me because I'm wondering, well, why? What's holding it back? And part of that, what was holding it back was the recognition and the gratitude for my current car. And that was a quick lesson I learned. And immediately I recognized that, my car has feelings too. It has taken me all over this place, and I'm essentially, wanting to get something new. And that's perfectly fine because part of our perhaps reason for being here is to create and to create experiences. And that's where my cognition came from today. See, after that of looking at the Nissan Rogue for the last, I'll say 4 weeks, I started to be introduced because I was watching videos within my YouTube feed. And these videos, of course, were of the Nissan Rogue. And then one day, a Nissan Ariya popped up in my field. And a Nissan Ariya is a EV vehicle. It's a premier or a premium vehicle that Nissan is creating. I love the name Ariya. Like that is just like I can definitely see like sakura and which are cherry blossoms, and I can see a beautiful feminine energy, and even the vehicle itself is very modernly designed. Actually, it's futuristically designed in the interior. It's a very beautiful car. It's crazy beautiful, and they have this color called Northern Lights Metallic that is phenomenal, because that's another thing. I was always imagining, because my car was red, that now I was going to switch to blue because blue was my favorite color. And for whatever reason in the past, I chose a red car. So for the last 17 years, I've driven around a red car, keeping in mind the red, it has a symbolism to it. Anyways, so this sudden idea of a green car and northern lights, especially because I would love to travel to see the northern lights, to witness it, to do no thing videos, to meditate underneath that energy. And so this really appealed to me. And yet it was an EV, and that's something that perhaps hasn't appealed to me. And yet, learning about it, learning that this particular car actually had a technology which you could wirelessly charge the car, expanded my horizons. And then from there, I saw another vehicle called the ID Buzz. And this was one of Volkswagen's reimaginations of their classic, you know, camper like vehicle, that too being an EV. Now, EVs, they have a maximum range in which they can go. And of course, having a battery relies a lot more on, well, a battery. And so these, well, perhaps not being the ideal vehicle to travel back across Canada, they are definitely extremely beautiful vehicles. And they allowed me to open my mind up to a larger possibility than the Nissan Rogue. See, the Nissan Rogue is a classic car, we can say. It's driven by a lot of people. I've often seen a lot of them driving around now, especially as I focus my attention and energy on them. But what had actually happened was, by opening my mind up to those possibilities, I then started to see the Nissan Murano. And I was also introduced recently to the Nissan Pathfinder. And the Nissan Pathfinder had this video that they showed the vehicle driving into the mountain, like directly off road into the mountain. And I thought, I'd like to do that. And it has a back area that could actually have a queen size mattress on it with a full sunroof, a moonroof they call it. And you could literally drive into the woods, bear infested or not, with this Nissan Pathfinder off-roading up in the north, and sleep on a mattress that's a queen size mattress that you brought along with you. I'd like to do that. And then from there, I started to seeing other vehicles such as the Nissan, I think it's called Nissan Pilot. Hello, B. I have this bee right now that's checking me out, trying to see if I'm a flower because it's looking at my light in a different way. Uh, I have yet to be comfortable with a bee landing on me, although I did have one land on my top of my head for a while and I let it sit there and meditate for a bit. But anyways, back to the story. And then from there, I started looking at all of the so-called competition, but rather than call it competition, all the other imaginative creations of the similar car classes to the Nissan Rogue and to the Nissan Pathfinder. And I started to see other cars such as the Genesis. And that is a beautiful spaceship with wheels. And where all this is going is essentially around the idea that what I have been perhaps limited by was my dreaming too small. See, because what I was dreaming of is I was dreaming of buying something. And, the challenge with that idea of buying something is the idea of ownership. It's the idea of limiting myself to that one vehicle going forward and essentially investing that much energy or, currency or fiat currency more so into the purchasing of one thing when perhaps there was something larger out there. And I don't necessarily mean just larger as in, a more expensive vehicle that's going to meet the needs, such as the Pathfinder, for example. It actually is a larger vehicle. It's larger in, size. And so therefore my 6 foot size body would be better accommodated to it. It also has 3 rows. So you can have up to 8 people, which kind of matches with my ideas of a larger family going forward and, building a community. But it also has a crazy towing capacity. It has a super large ability to, transfer things. You can knock down the 2 car seats and it's larger. And there's many other different aspects. But the point being is that what I started to realize and where my epiphany came from today, and why I'm sharing this with you today on Sean's Thoughts, is that I was recognizing as I was walking with only an hour ago that I myself was dreaming far too small. When I limited myself to just the Nissan Rogue, I was, placing myself in a world where I would live with that one vehicle when in all actuality, what I've been experiencing and what YouTube was even helping me with is opening my mind up to that there are a lot of other potentials. And did I necessarily want to buy a Rogue and become a Nissan Rogue owner? Or was I actually more in alignment with wanting to experience all of these other vehicles, to have that experience of driving all of these other vehicles, that allowing the idea of me or the image of me driving a whole multitude of different vehicles? You know, there's a lot of vehicles that are beyond the menu of what we know is possible. And the Genesis is a really good example of it. But even the Ariya was a really good example of it because most of us in this world, we've essentially lived in a world where even our cars, although we see them, as new and this and that, when I started to watch all these videos that were done by this amazing channel called Donut Confections, I'll actually put that video in there because these two brothers have done a really amazing job reviewing different cars. And when I started to look at it, they show an array of different versions of luxury, all the way down from what, a year ago I would have thought was luxury, simply a new car that perhaps was a little bit bigger on the inside because I'm a pretty big person, like physically size. I intend to get bigger, by the way. And so I'm gonna need something bigger. But that was my idea. That perception of the older version of me saw luxury as simply getting a new car. And, that's often what a lot of people do in what I've seen anyways, is they see these new condos that are being built with this IKEA cut and paste copied crap of creating these 800 square feet condos. And because it's all new for a couple days anyways, that, it's what they're dreaming of always being and always having. And they jump into it. And actually, right now, a lot of those people are, giving up that dream for financial reasons. And in a sense, I was looking at, buying that car and attaching that to my identity as a Nissan Rogue owner, when in all actuality, I realized I want to have the experience of driving the Nissan Rogue, yes, because in certain situations, the size of the vehicle, the 4 to 5 seat capacity, actually, you can get the higher one that perhaps only has the four. But with my desire, for instance, to drive across Canada, that might be, if we're just going along the number one highway all the way over to St. John's, that might be the perfect ideal vehicle. But yet, if I truly do desire to go to Northwest Territories and meet those amazing people up there and, stand underneath the Northern Lights, then a vehicle such as the Pathfinder may be more ideal. And of course, if I want to go over to Mars to climb Mount Olympus, well, I'm going to get something more similar to a UFO. And so my point being is that I recognize now that I was in essentially playing a part, and I say a part, in limiting myself based on, what I thought the menu was. And that's another lesson, as I mentioned before, from my former mentor, Kevin Trudeau, when he explained to us that oftentimes that we'll go places or we'll see things, and if we don't know what the menu is, then we're unable to actually truly experience the potential. If we sit ourselves in limitation because we, hold ourselves back to be aware, because we maybe believe, oh, that's not on my radar screen, I can't have that. And we start all that naysay, self sabotage type of ideas. But yet, when I was able to sit back and start looking at those videos of vehicles that at the time I imagined, or I couldn't imagine myself owning an EV vehicle, because I had gotten into that light talking about all the negative stuff about it, talking about the limitations it had, talking about, what could happen. Oh, the battery could do this. And so I was limiting myself from even looking at it. But just by seeing the Nissan Ariya's interior and seeing it more as a spaceship, more in a line with, what I imagine the potential of our future to look like, I then opened myself to other possibilities, such as, I said, the Genesis. And even with the Genesis, I can't imagine, driving into the bear country with that vehicle, and, it may not work. But yet it could possibly work if I were to, drive back and forth to Vancouver again in the future, produce another play, or maybe even get onto the set of my upcoming TV series called Transmission, which I know will be produced some way, one form or another. And maybe not in Vancouver, maybe it'll be in Mexico. You never know. Or on location in Antarctica. That would be awesome too. Because this particular movie or series starts in China, it moves over to India, it goes over to Argentina, and then it goes over to Antarctica. So perhaps I'll be driving an Infinity or a Genesis around the movie set in Antarctica. You never know. Sky's the limit. And that's kind of where I talked in the description about the idea of shooting for the moon. See, we get this idea that if we shoot for something that we're comfortable with, we have a higher possibility of obtaining it. And that's essentially, in my opinion, anyways, a limiting program that we have been, programmed with. The idea that if I shoot for the known and I get a little bit lower or I miss the mark, well, at least I'm closer to getting it for when I do it next time. But yet, one of the most powerful lessons that I learned early on in my own waking experience was that if I shoot for the moon, then even if I miss the mark, I'll probably be a lot higher in my intentional or my intentions or my creations of, by shooting for the moon and missing the moon, rather than shooting for, just across the river because I thought maybe I could just get across the river. And this was an important lesson in my original training by my former mentor, Steve Scott, which I learned essentially from this Max GXL product. But nonetheless, yeah, I see I don't know, a calm trail. That stuff doesn't work, guys, anymore. It's over. Anyway, so yeah, that's kind of my experience with this whole idea that I truly do wish to experience driving all of these different vehicles and opening myself up to the possibility. And this leads into even the possibility of ownership. You know, if you ever have an idea of, for instance, you have this idea that maybe you want to own a yacht, and we have this idea of, living on a yacht would be awesome, and I would love to live on a yacht, and you imagine living on a yacht, you even go look at a yacht and all that lovely stuff, and you can imagine yourself living on a yacht. But maybe you haven't lived or experienced life on a boat for very long. I had an experience when I went to Taiwan, and I was on this small yacht-like boat, and the waters got choppy and I've got vomiting. That was fun. Anyway, so without that experience, I wouldn't have known that perhaps I didn't wanna live on a any sort of yacht that where it was always moving. And nonetheless, maybe we have this idea that we wanna live on a yacht, and so we go and we do everything to live on a yacht, but after we get the yacht, we pay that 1,000,000, 2,000,000, 5,000,000, whatever it is. Well, on top of the idea of ownership of a yacht, there comes the maintenance of the yacht, the dock fees of the yacht, getting someone to perhaps crew the yacht, the choppy waters on those days when, the waters are the way they are. We might not want to live on a yacht because we might want to have land beneath our feet. So, where I'm getting to all of that is sometimes we or I misunderstand what I truly want, as rather than wanting the ownership of a yacht, I would love to live on a yacht until I would choose to live somewhere else. So rather than perhaps, and going forward for myself, definitely, rather than imagining owning something or buying something, taking my stamp of my name and cha-ching onto the actual document that says I own that, rather than that, perhaps, I would prefer maybe to have the experiences. And maybe that's, as I've come to understand it, the purpose that we are here is to have those experiences and to shy away from the idea of owning something. Because do we ever truly own anything? The house that we live in, even if you have a deed that says, I own this land, well, apparently, reading the deed, we don't really own the land. We may own the expectation of the requirement of maintenance of that particular house or apartment, but do we own the land? And, many people, including myself, would say no, we don't own the land. First and foremost, everything is of God, so God kind of owns everything. But yet, there are other claims to ownership when it comes to the world that we live in. Even when we say we own a car, the way that our current system is set up is that we don't really own the car. And a lot of times you can even flip the script and look at it as that the houses own us, because now we have the expectation of maintenance, the expectation of upkeep, the expectation of that whole idea that buying a house may be more of a money pit, especially when we look into the consumerism and the way that things are designed nowadays. And so that's perhaps food for thought for, me, myself, and I going forward, because maybe that's what was limiting me, is dreaming far too small, dreaming into the idea of ownership when in fact ownership owns us as opposed to the other way around. And the experiences of, living on a yacht or driving a Nissan Pathfinder or even driving the Nissan Ariya, or perhaps any of the other vehicles, and even going around the world, it's the experiences that I'm truly seeking, that I'm looking for. So going forward, this really helped me to understand that, you know, everything is momentary, and allowing things to change, such as I'm going through right now. I'm on the verge of moving, and a lot of people would look at my experience and saying, like, where are you going? And I'm like, I'm somewhere, I'm going somewhere, because I know and I trust and I have faith. And I recognize that everything is about experiences, and essentially everything that we experience builds us into a stronger version of ourselves. And even with this channel that I created, there's that old movie called Field of Dreams. And there's these spirits that essentially talk to Kevin Costner in the movie, and they say, build it and they will come. Well, guess what, folks? I built it and they will come. Who's they? Well, you listening is one of they. And the people that are listening that are hiding and, they're observing from behind a veil, those ones came too as well. But yet also, this podcast is essentially for those who will come and those who will arrive and those who perhaps will one day reach a resonant frequency where this information may do something for them, whatever that is. And so I'll leave you with that. Shoot for the moon, perhaps, and let's have some amazing experiences going forward. And, come over to Patreon or, PayPal or however it is if you want to help contribute to this dream that I wish to create, because I'm no longer dreaming far too small. I'm dreaming beyond the moon. Actually, I'm dreaming beyond Saturn. And we'll get into that later. And, how maybe when we look up to the sky, what we see isn't all that really's there. And yeah, that's coming out in the mainstream news now, definitely. Anyways, thank you for sharing your time and attention with Sean's thoughts. And yeah, I truly do appreciate you. And I appreciate all of those who perhaps will join me on this amazing adventure, this amazing race as we dart and fly towards future potential. Have a great day.